with the Russian elections. Of course, we already know Putin's going to be reelected with overwhelming numbers. But what do Russians really think? Well, leaked calls from one soldier on the front lines reveals that Russians' actual thoughts about Putin might just be just a little more balanced. Let's get into it. This is coming to us, of course, from Insight from Ukraine and Russia. And guys, you should absolutely subscribe to his channel. I only take a look at like 10% of his videos. He has so many leaked videos. He's got to be getting them from Ukrainian intelligence sources. So definitely subscribe, become a member of his channel. And I linked to his stuff in the description. So you should definitely take a look. Okay, let's get into it.
Here an interesting intercepted phone call of a Russian mobilized soldier who genuinely shared his view on everything that is going on in Russia and in the Russian army. So let's listen to it.
О, а что там, расскажи по новостям, что там, Пригожин?
Okay, so his friend asks him, basically the soldier goes, oh, what's the news? Did they KIA Prigozhin? So remember, this is when, right after Prigozhin was taken out, is probably when this was recorded.
Ну, там как не он был в списках. То есть как он регистрировался на этих самолетах.
Но он жив?
Пока ничего не известно.
So here's the thing. They say, well, not exactly. They say he was on the lists, registered for the plane, but it's unknown if he's alive. There was a brief period where that was the rumor being spread, that maybe Prigozhin had somehow been alive, or it might have been his body double. But it's pretty clear that that isn't the case. And it seems like even to this Russian, they too seem to be fully aware that that's not really the case. What I think is interesting, you can hear the soldier sounds like he's in some kind of talk or command center or communication center. There's a lot of beeping and buzzing.
В это трудно поверить, в это очень трудно поверить, но короче, надо будет крепиться. Очень все непросто. Ты же понимаешь, кто такой Пригожин?
So this is interesting. He says, we'll have to brace ourselves. It's not going to be easy at all. He says, do you understand who Prigozhin is? He's the only one who could. So it sounds like this is a Prigozhin loyalist. And I want to, it's important to bear in mind, guys, that Prigozhin, when he staged his coup, never really had the general officers flip over to his side, but he was what's sometimes called a soldier's general. And that means that he was very popular with the rank and file of the Russian military, right? Very few Russian ground troops opposed Wagner Group as they marched through Russia. Only aircraft, combat aircraft, which remember are piloted generally by career officers, were the only forces that really took the fight to Wagner Group. And I think that's really telling about the perception by the rank and file of the Russian military and the Kremlin, that when the chips were down, none of them were willing to go up against Wagner Group or even necessarily oppose Wagner Group.
Единственное, короче, Путин все гайки закрутил, просто все это. Сталин, короче, это просто пионер по сравнению.
So this is interesting. He says compared to, he says Putin has tightened all the screws, just everything. Compared to him, Stalin was just a pioneer, a first grader. And I think this is interesting for a couple reasons. First, he's right. Putin, following the death of Prigozhin, did tighten the screws. He arrested Igor Girkin, who was a notable mill blogger. And what's interesting is that, you know, Putin has always been unkind to opposition political forces like Alexei Navalny, right? But Alexei Navalny is a liberalist, right? He wanted freer elections. He wanted Russian opposition. He exposed the Kremlin corruption, a very standard type of opposition to totalitarian regimes like Putin's. But what's fascinating is that Igor Girkin is actually a strident supporter of the Kremlin, a strident supporter of Putin, and in many ways, a strident supporter of the Russian army and war effort in Ukraine. Girkin is probably 75 to 80% aligned with the Kremlin in terms of objectives, values, and methods. But critically, Putin decided that Igor Girkin was still a little too willing to criticize the Russian Ministry of Defense. It's not enough to share objectives and debate about what is the best method, right, for, in this case, dominating Ukraine. But Gherkin was, for too long, Putin decided, questioning the strategy, questioning how the Ministry of Defense ran the war. And instead of trying to listen to those criticisms, right, as would happen in a democracy, Putin had Gherkin jailed. And that sent a message to all the other mill bloggers in the space that they couldn't continue to push a narrative that went against that of the Kremlin. So for a brief period, Putin was willing to tolerate a certain type of free speech. He was willing to tolerate free speech that supported Ukrainian objectives, but offered differing analyses of how to do it. And that, I think, actually may have helped sell the war to the Russian public. But slowly, as the war went on and Russian losses mounted, and they increasingly looked unable to achieve what they wanted on the battlefield, the mill blogger community started to turn on the MoD. And after Prigozhin, I think Putin decided that all of this level of dissent was unacceptable. So now the Russian military, of course, has no source of public criticism at all. The level of criticism permitted is extremely narrow, extremely small. This is why the caller is comparing Putin to Stalin, who also famously purged the Red Army of many of its best officers prior to the Second World War, who famously engaged in some of the most aggressive political purges of any Soviet leader.
Пригожин — это единственный, кто, может, что-то какое-то.
This is interesting. You guys can't see it. Let me see if I can show you. What he says is, Prigozhin is the only one who can challenge Putin.
Поспорить, я понял.
The friend says, he can argue. I get it. The soldier responds, it's not like these guys from the armed forces who sent 6 guys to storm the Ukrainians, or those Oman guys who beat up students with sticks. So what he's talking about is the fact that sorry, let me get everything back lined up here. So what he's saying is that Prigozhin, he's the only person who could challenge Putin, and that looks true, right? That looks true when he was alive. He was the Russian military rank and file really thought highly of him. Wagner Group was the only combat effective force, and Prigozhin's star shined pretty bright, and he was willing, most critically, to speak directly to the Russian public, and that was a dangerous, dangerous thing to do, especially as he slowly began to say more and more truthful things and began to become more and more aggressive towards Putin. And so he's saying that the armed forces, right? This is a Russian MoD sending 6 guys to storm the Ukrainians. That is Russian storm groups, where Russian troops will use relatively small numbers of assault troops to actually do the ground assaults after using artillery and tank fire to prepare Ukrainian positions for this ground assault. But it's pretty iconic that these Russian ground troops are done in very small numbers. And of course, Oman guys are Russian federal police doing riot control. Beating up students with sticks is a euphemism for riot control.
Конченые вооруженные силы, которые отправляют 6 человек штурмовать хохлов. И не вот эти конченые ОМОНовцы, которые студентов палками закрутил гайки, там у него армия в Москве стоит больше, чем здесь. У него
Right. He claims Putin has tightened the screws. He has an army in Moscow bigger than here being Ukraine. And what I find interesting is that, the caller is arguing that there's actually a large Russian MoD presence in Moscow larger than in Ukraine. Probably not true, but you're seeing that increasingly Putin has to make these trade-offs, these rob Peter to pay Paul type trade-offs, where he will have to say, okay, do I deploy this round of troops to Ukraine, or do I use it to stabilize the domestic situation. Another example would be the way the Russian MoD has to choose with Ukrainian forces operating in Belgorod in Russia. Oftentimes, Russian forces say, they have to look and say, all right, do I take this next battalion of troops and put it on the front lines, or do I have to deploy it to Belgorod because it is politically so damning to have Ukrainian forces operate in Russian territory?
Все, которые там ВВ, вот эти Росгвардии, они почему там все крепанулись, понимаешь?
This is also interesting. They talk about the Rosguardia. They said, why did they bow down to Prigozhin? Rosguardia is the Russian National Guard, or think of Ministry of Interior troops. And they ask, why did they bow down to Prigozhin? Well, the answer is because the Rosguardia, these regular rank and file troops really thought highly of Prigozhin, especially relative, even though Prigozhin actually pioneered the strategy of assault units, 6 guys supported by a bunch of weapon systems in order to take territory. But he says, and correctly, he says, Wagner is the only real combat-ready unit that can fight against the Ukrainians. And it's true. If you look back the last year, at the end of the day, the only forces that have an actual track record of seizing territory from Ukraine in the last year are Wagner troops. Russian MoD forces have been entirely on the defense, and they've only been being pushed back.
Вот Вагнера это единственное боеспособное, самое боеспособное реально, которое с хохлами может...
And I actually suspect that Prigozhin hoped that the Ukrainian counteroffensive would be a much greater success than it was, right? He timed his coup attempt around and concurrent with the start of Ukraine's counteroffensive. I think he believed that the counteroffensive, or not the start, but like the midpoint of the counteroffensive, I think he believed that the counteroffensive would really inflict large numbers of casualties on Russian troops. And he intentionally made sure Wagner troops were not available to be sent into that fighting. And that would mean that if the Russian MoD, if large portions of those formations were destroyed, that would leave Wagner as the only fighting force in all of Russia. Says they're not dumb and not corrupt, which actually might be close to the case, or they're less dumb and less corrupt.
Не коррумпированные и, они не тупые. То есть, не знаю, пока вот здесь это...
And bear in mind, guys, Russian generals, they are not dumb individually, but militaries reflect the system they are built around. And Russia as a military emphasizes large numbers of low-skill troops with a small number of specialists and even smaller number of leaders. Their tactics are meant to be simple. They're meant to be conscript-friendly. And they increasingly are unable to draw on even Russians. So many of their troops are going to be potentially Cubans, Kazakhs, Tajiks, able-bodied men, sure, with some varying levels of military training, but oftentimes without even a sophisticated understanding of the Russian language, which is dangerous because you cannot communicate a complex plan to those type of troops. So you need to have simple plans. You need to also, those troops struggle to communicate, right? Imagine if you had a Tajik logistics unit trying to support a Russian-speaking combat unit, right? How would the Russian combat unit even communicate their logistical needs to a Tajik unit? Do you see how these sort of problems can become exacerbated? And this isn't just about linguistics. DPR, LPR units have been folded up into the Russian military, but with varying degrees. For a long time, they were fought as independent units, literally from an independent country, side by side with Russian units from a totally different independent country. There's also irregular Russian volunteer units, similar. There's also these Storm Z forces. There was Wagner forces operating for a long time. So you see how when you have this broken up chain of command, there's a limited number of things you can do with them. It's sort of like driving a car where a third of the parts are missing, or worse yet, driving a car that has parts from many different cars. It's going to be very hard to make it work in a way that is elegant and sensible. Instead, you're going to have to find techniques and choose routes that are simple, right? If you don't have a steering wheel that works, you got to find a route that doesn't involve any turning. Those are the kind of solutions you have to come to navigate the military you have. So to call it dumb is sort of an understatement. An institution can be dumb, and I think the Russian institutional structure definitely is, but the individuals are not stupid within it, if that makes sense.
Просто эти вооруженные силы, это просто конченое. Короче, нас будут кидать в расход.
It says the armed forces are just complete crap. They'll throw us in the meat grinder. All mobilized soldiers. Well, maybe not all. Maybe some will survive.
Может, не всех, кто-нибудь может выжить. Но, короче, модиков вот сейчас будут, мы всем просто это единственное объяснение, которое то, что здесь происходит.
It's the only explanation for what's happening here. We're just expendable. And this is true, right? When you have these sort of mobilization or conscript type policies, there's actually an incentive for commanders. If they know that they only have soldiers for X number of months, and they need to achieve tactical objectives, then there's an incentive to use those soldiers now, because if they go home, the thinking is that you've left combat power on the table, right? Your goal would be on the final day of the soldier's contract, you attrit down the last soldier, meaning you've gotten all the combat power you're going to get out of them. It's a perverse incentive, but again, you get the incentive, you get the behavior that you incentivize within the system that you've built. And Russia has built a system in which there's a large number of people, there's a high rate of rotation, there's a low level of training, and a high level of attrition. The result is that you actually treat soldiers as being ever more expendable.
Просто в расход. То, что, короче, типа поднимется, ну так вчера говорили, типа это. То, что у Путина рейтинги упадут, я говорю, у электронных голосования уже все прям просчитал Путин.
Ooh, this is true. Say Putin has actually already calculated everything with electronic voting, and it's true. Russia is having its voting day today. They say the turnout is actually incredibly low, even by Russian standards, and that voting in these elections is, again, like largely a foregone conclusion. Hand-selected candidates are being run. Oftentimes, there is a facsimile of choice. There might be several approved parties, but none of those parties are going to actually have functional ideological differences. They might have different perspectives on low stakes affairs of state, right? Should the Russian flag have a deeper red in it, or should we rename some command in the Russian military, pre-approved debate points. But in terms of actually changing the way the country is run, there isn't real opposition. Every party, every candidate is selected by Putin. And while elections still on the local level have some, apparently, according to most reports, have some level of freedom in Russia, right? Small local elections may have some candidates that end up in office who are not too far outside the norm, but might be a bit edgier than Putin would like to see. It's a very, very controlled sort of opposition in which there's not really ever going to be an election that changes the fundamental outlook of how the system operates. And so he says his theory is that Putin has already calculated everything with electronic voting. And that seems to be sometimes the case, that but the elections are fiction, not because the outcome is exactly predetermined, but because in all the issues that count, there is no chance for the outcome to be changed.
Это все фикция, понятно, да, изначально, что это выборы фикция. И, короче, кто просто проголосовал не за Путина, это будет составляться...
And the soldier alleges that, in short, anyone who didn't vote for Putin, they'll make a list, it'll be some stupid questionnaire.
Просто это чисто будет анкетирование тупо, чтобы выявлять тех...
And to identify those who are against Putin in the country. I think that's 100%. it's just like when your office sends you an anonymous survey. If you take it on your work computer, guess what, lads? It's not anonymous. And even if you were to fill it out, people aren't stupid. If you say, man, I don't really like my supervisor with his dumb shaved head and his goofy beard, well, you're going to know that you work for Paul. And you're going to be like, great, it's one of 3 people. And the other people Paul works for are doofuses. So if there's an articulate point, you go, okay, I know exactly who wrote this. I don't need their name on the form to retaliate. So you see stuff like that and you're like, that I think is sort of the game they're playing here. Again, they do probably want to find people who actually are opposed to Putin, and an election is an easy way to do that.
Против Путина внутри страны.
Да, просто посмотреть, да.
Лёх, это просто, короче, просто они хотят, это геноцид. Это геноцид, с которым завязан Путин. Тут гвозди, расчет. О чем тут говорить? Здесь у нас 3500 генералов. Каждому надо украсть.
Yeah, this is also feels true. Now, don't get me wrong, guys. Every military has to impose some number of limits on resources, right? There's always that. But there are some resources that the limit is very, very liberal. For example, when I was deployed, actually, we would order what are called supplements. And supplements, they're not like supplements today where you buy them at GNC. It's a term for non-ration foodstuffs. And in our case, our FOB fell in love with energy drinks. We had so many. This is all true, by the way. Every failed energy drink brand basically tried to get a contract with the U.S. military. And the U.S. military was so desperate to get soldiers caffeine, stimulants, that they signed just about every contract you could. Pitbull, the rapper, he used to have an energy drink, and we used to order it. A lot of it. And guess what, guys? Those energy drinks failed because they were gross. They were gross if you drank them cool out of a fridge. They were even grosser if you, let's say like me, stuffed them in your pockets and went on patrol in Afghanistan. And then in 130-degree heat in the middle of the day when you were starting to flag, you popped a Pit Bowl or a Standing Rock or whatever, or some thrashing rock or something. But the point is, it was absolutely a gross experience. And let's see if we can find Pitbull energy drink. Oh man, they redesigned it. Look at this. Look at this. So obviously Red Bull, Venom Energy, Pitbull. Yeah, they redesigned it a lot. I think, yeah, obviously now there's Bang Energy and stuff. Yeah. But you can see this is the kind of gross stuff that we were drinking. You can imagine how just disgusting this was. But the point is that experience like traumatized me. And we ordered so many, by the way, our 200-person FOB would get calls because we were ordering as many energy drinks as a 2,000-person FOB. Like us and the brigade headquarters ordered the same number of energy drinks. That's how like fraught and problematic it was. Anyway, the point is that experience led me to develop Strike Gum. That's right. Now that I have an audience, I was like, you know what? I'm going to find a way to put an entire energy drink into a single piece of gum. And I worked with a manufacturer here in Denver to do just that. That's right. Each piece of this gum contains as much caffeine as a Red Bull or an Amp. In fact, I think it has as much caffeine as a Pitbull energy drink. So we are totally set. And if you are interested in picking some up, you can join the hundreds of people who've already ordered some, which thank you so much to everyone that has. You can go to strikegum.com and pick some up today. Of course, we also have an affiliate program where if you want to actually promote the gum, if you've been interested in affiliate marketing and content creation, we've had dozens of sales so far. We have a Discord. We have all the assets you need. So you can definitely sign up there. But if you want some, go to strikegum.com. It's great. But here's the thing, guys. Nails, remember, look at how many Russian fortifications there are. So the fact that they're not limiting like energy drinks, they're limiting nails. And I'm also here to tell you guys, the grift here, I don't believe U.S. generals, as far as I could tell, were not the ones stealing in Afghanistan, but the incentive, right? When you're fighting a war, you need money to go out. And because it's a war, you destroy a certain percentage of the stuff that goes out. So you'll sit there and say, hey, we just expect that when we spend some money, that it's not going to return in a financial way, right? And we don't really need to we expect that some of the things we buy will be destroyed. A lot of the things we buy will be destroyed. And that, for a war profiteer, is a tremendously great situation. All right. And that's what the U.S. kind of deals with. For example, we were once sent a radio. They told us it was an advanced satellite radio, unlike anything else on the battlefield. And they sent it to us and they said, it's $1 million and you have to sign for it. You can't refuse. So I said, great. How do I use it? And they said, a contractor will be around to teach your people how to use it any day now. And for the remainder of our deployment, I had $1 million communication system. Well, something the government paid $1 million for, but we never once saw a contractor actually come to our FOB and teach us how the thing worked. So I suspect there probably was never a satellite overhead. There was probably never advanced communication devices in that thing. They probably did one mock-up that they got approved and they signed the contract. And then they probably had like a handful of these radios in maybe Bagram Air Base. But then the rest were just empty junk. The U.S. government actually had something called explosive detectors, right? That they awarded a contract for. Explosive detector machine fraud. Let's see if we can find it. Here we go. The ADE 651 is a fake bomb detector produced by a company called Advanced Tactical and Security Communications. It was a scam, just a dowsing rod. As you could see, it claimed that the device could effectively and accurately detect various explosives, drugs, ivory, and other substances from long range. It's been sold to 20 countries in the Middle East and Asia, including Iraq and Afghanistan, for as much as $60,000 a pop. The Iraqi government, that is the U.S. government, spent $52 million on the devices. But the BBC actually tested the thing and said it was a glorified dowsing rod, had no detection ability. In January, the device was banned by the British government, and the director was arrested on suspicion of fraud. Other companies were raided by the British police. Right? But the device is still in use by the Iraqi and Pakistani security forces. There's also very similar devices called GT200s and Alpha 6s in Thailand and Mexico that have been scrutinized. Right? It was called a descendant of the Quadro Tracker Positive Molecule Locator, which was a just generic detection device made up by some guy. Cards were programmed by copying a Polaroid photograph of the target, cutting up the resulting copy, and pasting the pieces onto 2 squares of plastic. Completely made up. It just absolutely unscientific gobbledygook. And yet they won a contract, something you and I could design a test for this thing. It would be very simple. You take a real explosive, like a firearm. You go and you just go to a local gun store. You buy some bullets and you empty out some of the bullets and you put explosive in the other bullets, and then you just shoot it and see if it can accurately detect whether or not the weapon actually has explosive stuff in it. And insanely, impossibly, no one ever actually did this. Not the government, not the Iraqi government, not the Pakistanis. Madness. This is how, right? Russia has the unsophisticated system that generals literally just siphon off poorly accounted for gear. In the U.S. and the West, the stealing is done via fraudulent contracts, like the fake explosive detector.
Все. В общем, в стране просто творится. Я тебе вот говорю, что это все, короче, сейчас просто цветочки. Я не знаю, как будет, наша судьба какая, но, короче, какую нам судьбу готовит начальства, я уже примерно догадываюсь. И все,
And actually, you know what, guys? Let me know. I know I have a lot of veterans that watch this channel. Let me know in the comments what the biggest scam combat device, product, weapon system that you saw pushed out on your deployment was.
Типа, вот так, да не, сейчас все нормально, сейчас будет ротация, короче, такую хуйню говорят. Это сейчас вот мы 7 дней, короче, и все. С апреля месяца уже звучит.
I'm not sure what any of this is in reference to. He's just like everything. There'll be a rotation. I think he's talking about lying about rotation.
Вот сколько я пошел сюда, меня, да как овец на бойню, я тебе отвечаю. Просто вот и ведут, гладят, такая, что все, понимаешь?
Да, а рядом трупы без голов лежат, да?
Я это видел, я это видел.
This is interesting. He says, well, Leak, you go with an AK and a shovel against machine guns, artillery, cluster munitions, birds, drones dropping grenades. And yeah, so definitely an indicator. Again, this is sort of the Russian light infantry strategy in which they try to use their own artillery to sort of pave the way for these light infantry to do a frontal assault. But remember, guys, your enemy is in trenches, and Russian artillery is not that effective. So the result is exactly what he's describing.
С калашом и лопатой лезешь на пулеметы, арту, кассеты, там летают птички, бросают гранаты. И ты такой человек с калашами, там пулемета даже нет ни у кого.
Right. A squad of 20 people without a single machine gun is insanity. To give you an idea, most fire teams in the United States carry at least one machine gun.
Там будут делать. А хохлы, короче, мне
So a 20-person platoon would have 8 machine guns in a NATO-equipped force, and that's more or less on par with what we've seen from Ukrainian forces as well. So the fact that we're looking at 20 is troubling.
Видео показывал, короче, прикинь, знаешь, сколько делал вот эту посадку 1700, которую мы штурмовали. Они, короче, они уже стебутся над нами, они, короче, там хохлядский флаг повесили.
This is actually rumored to be part of the Ukrainian strategy, that they deliberately want Russian forces to throw themselves at Ukrainian forces and inflict the maximum number of casualties on Russian troops. Because again, the Ukrainians need to raise the casualty rate for Russia because they can replenish troops much faster than the Russians can replenish their manpower faster than Ukrainians can. They simply have a country with a larger population. So this is probably part and parcel to the strategy. How well is it working? It sort of depends. Again, there's rumors that the Ukrainians are inflicting casualties at about a 30 to 35% greater rate than the Russians are, but it's tough to say what the real math is, since all casualties are not created equal, right?
Просто они, короче, они байтят нас, понял? Эти вооруженные силы, это просто конченое.
Нам тут говорят, что вы там все ездите на Т-90 прорыв.
Right, the T-90 is Russia's most advanced main battle tank. It hasn't been produced in any meaningful numbers. Most people haven't even seen one on the battlefield. It's not clear that it's deployed anywhere. In the battlefield at this point, but mostly Russian forces rely on T-72s. Sometimes you even see earlier tanks, right? And a T-72 is you got to remember, it's functional for what it needs to be. If you're a light infantry soldier in a trench, it doesn't matter if it's a T-72 or a T-90, right? A tank is kind of a tank.
Короче, это может быть, но это настолько далеко от передовой, они там на нем ездят. Чтобы точно не въебало, как бы. И эти арматы, терминаторы, телек смотрели тогда в деревню, приезжали, мы ссывались, там, короче, показывают.
So I'm not sure. I think Armatas and Terminators, I think these are like staged events in which a Russian soldier with the nickname of Terminator, he rides a T-90 and like, we're going to interview Terminator. And they say, they show...
Короче, мобилизованные где, понял, там траншея, отделанная вагонкой, там как по уставу вот это...
Right. This is also something that the U.S. military does in spades, which is when higher ups or PAO or the public affairs office is going to be looking at you. You go through and you put on a big dog and pony show so that they don't see the reality of what's happening. So things look better than they are. And so they probably, if they're going to be filming a propaganda video, even at the brigade or battalion level, they'll throw resources at the site where this is going to happen so things look better. No commander wants to get the phone call that says, hey, I saw your guys on TV. Why aren't they? Why don't their trenches have their trenches have panels? And usually it's blamed on the individual soldiers being lazy or not doing their job right. But more often than not, right, soldiers want to do things the right way. But mostly it is a function of poor leadership, poor resources, or demands on a mission that are too great, right? Now, obviously that's not true, right? Enlisted soldiers, right? They would take off their armor. I once had a squad leader who took off the side plates, the side ballistic plates from their protective vest. I was like, no, you don't get to do these things. But when you're talking about a whole battalion that operates this way, it's not because they don't want to, right? Like people would much rather be in a trench with wooden panels and regulations, but they can't because they don't have wood or because they're not in a location for a long enough period of time. And that's okay. It's a war. These things happen, but there's no reason to waste your time lying about it.
Ладно, такой, там это все начерчено. Выходишь, такие бойницы, там пулеметчик стоит, бдит. Мы просто усывались где-нибудь, теряли, думаю, где-нибудь в Воронежской области, наверное, где-нибудь.
We've actually watched, I think, this exact propaganda video, and it's so clearly shot in a peacetime area. I think you can see that the grass is actually cut. Someone is cutting the grass in and around where this is filmed.
Терминатор отлично зарекомендовал себя на СВО, вот эта поддержка танков.
Okay, SMO is probably like, they're saying tank support, light infantry assault. I think that's what they mean. Supporting the tanks by assaulting the positions.
Он катается, он даже за ноль не переезжал, за границу он даже не переезжал. Это просто... Сюда шлют, что не жалко. Потому списанные калаши, зэков, мобиков. Тут просто творится. Главное, вот это наступление было. Вот, знаешь, чем он закончил? Тем, что вот до полполка у нас потерь, и хотя мы на тех же позициях, где и были.
Yeah, as bad as this war is, as bad as it feels sometimes for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, where you look at the size of Zaporizhzhia and you go, wow, they haven't really made that much progress. Just remember, you could be a Russian regiment who we see them launch massive attacks and just get absolutely crushed in terms of casualties.
Что будет, я не знаю, с этой страной, но ничего хорошего не будет.
To be honest, he overestimated.
Okay, that is all I had, guys. Be sure to check out the channel, check out strikegum.com. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.